Hello, and welcome to Stingray Tom's Florida and a deep dive into Florida tourism history. John Nicholas Ringling died of pneumonia in December of 1936. Aged 70 when he died, he was, and continues to be, the name synonymous with the American circus. His name meant circus to millions of Americans. Over 80 years after his death, it still does. Yes, that sounds like the end of a story, but when it comes to the history of Florida tourism, it really is just the beginning. In 1920, some 16 years before his death, Ringling was one of the richest Americans with an estimated wealth of $200 million. A century later, that $200 million would be equal to $2.5 billion. While not entirely all circus money, much of it was, and it was the circus millions that allowed him to invest in other profitable ventures such as oil, short-line railroads, and great works of art. Ringling's beloved wife Mabel had died just 7 years before he had, and they had had no children. While he himself was one of 8 children, only his one sister Ida outlived him, and so he chose to leave little of his fortune to his family. His will stated that his sister Ida would receive a $5,000 a year annuity, but everything else would go to the state of Florida. When the terms of the will were made public, it was a stunning revelation within the Sarasota community as well as the rest of the United States. Even though the directions of his will were clear, there was a myriad of complications that took years to sort out. Immediately, relatives brought lawsuits against the estate, as did the many businesses to which Ringling was in debt. The former suits were questionable and often emotionally driven. The latter were typically more legitimate. By the time of Ringling's death in the midst of the Great Depression, his was the classic story of someone who was property rich but cash poor. His 2 bank accounts totaled $244. Considering that the Bureau of Internal Revenue had a $13 million claim against the estate, it's clear that most of the debt would have to be managed in some other way to allow the state of Florida to keep the art collection and estate. After Mabel had died, Ringling had married Emily Haig Buck and divorced her only a few months prior to his death. Not surprisingly, she asked the courts to set aside her divorce settlement and the provisions of Ringling's will in favor of receiving 1/3 of the entire estate. There was also a pending court-ordered sale of Ringling's remarkable Venetian-style mansion, as well as the millions of dollars of claims against the holdings. In reality, it's pretty remarkable that the Sarasota location we can visit today exists at all. Much of Ringling's holdings were tied up in parts of various businesses, including oil companies, ranching concerns, and railroads. These were difficult to sort out because Ringling wasn't always the sole owner, and in some cases, such as the railroads, there were governmental requirements that restricted modifications of ownership and liquidation. Ringling's massive art collection was another issue. At his death, he possessed 625 paintings and around 2,000 other art objects, including sculptures, furnishings, and ceramics. Many of his best works were in storage and were being used to guarantee outstanding loans. Without the ability to pay back these loans, much of the collection would have been given to the loan holders or sold off to raise the appropriate monies. And then there was the circus. John Ringling's holdings included a 1/3 share of the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus. This combined show, in reality a circus monopoly, included the remains of the Hagenbeck Wallace Circus, the John Robinson Circus, and Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show, among others. Over a span of 40 years, John Ringling and his 6 brothers bought out every successful American circus. The state of Florida stood to inherit 1/3 of the greatest show on earth. Even in the midst of the Depression, that was a significant income source, as long as its management was sorted out and the massive production could be operated profitably. The entire probate process of addressing Ringling's will and its complications took a full decade. 10 years to sort out all the holdings. 10 years to rule on all the lawsuits and negotiate how to resolve those that were determined to be valid. 10 years to preserve Ringling's Sarasota estate, including the mansion, gardens, art museum, and art collection. Emily Ringling's post-divorce claims were dismissed and the circus holdings were sorted out. It took the work of the executors, Ida Ringling North and John Ringling North, John's sister and nephew, as well as several Sarasota attorneys, New York attorneys, and 4 Florida governors. One of the most important aspects of Ringling's will was his express wish that the state keep the art collection whole. As the will stated, "No change by sale, trade, or other means shall be made in any of the paintings or objects of art." The state agreed to the stipulation and added legislation that required all property received under the will shall not be removed from the city of Sarasota. In January 1946, Florida took possession of the John and Mabel Ringling Museum of Art. Of course, the property had essentially languished for those 10 years. The long process of probate saw the entire place suffer from a lack of funds. There were caretakers, but they could only accomplish the bare minimum to keep things from falling into ruin. The buildings were in a precarious state, and many of the works of art were being slowly destroyed by the hot and humid climate, as well as dirt and dust. While everything appeared to be in horrible condition, the craftsmanship of the original construction process meant that the building damage was more cosmetic than structural. Prior to the state taking possession in 1946, maintenance work to the roof and windows were done to slow down the damage. But there was still much to be completed. When it came to the artwork, there were some that needed little attention, and a few that would never be able to be restored. But the largest number required conservation and restoration to be brought back to a proper state of repair. The process of restoring paintings in the 1940s was hardly an advanced one, and some important paintings wound up being more damaged in the process, though most achieved very positive results. In only 4 years, nearly half the original collection had been cleaned and restored. It was the largest art restoration project in the U.S., and techniques used during the work were exported to Europe, which had had a great need of art restoration after World War II. Much of the restoration work took place in the museum, sometimes in galleries open to visitors. There are stories of dozens of guests crowded around a huge painting, while a couple of restorers worked at removing old varnish, soot, grime, mold, and even Florida sand. Improvised pressure tables were weighted down by broken bits of sculpture. Prior to restoration, there were questions about the paintings. Some in the art world had thought that Ringling couldn't have possibly spent his money wisely, and that much of his collection was comprised of replicas or out-and-out forgeries. The restoration process answered these questions. In reality, many of the works were proved to be better works by better artists than even Ringling thought. As time passed, both the museum and Ringling's mansion were repaired to better than original condition. The art collection was saved, and for the first time it was fully cataloged. Art experts around the world were finally able to take a serious look at the collection. In 1950, Art News Annual stated that it contained the greatest collection of Baroque paintings in America. The Ringling collection, now the state of Florida's collection, was shown to be one of the most important collections of European painting from the 17th and 18th centuries. And now it was available for all to see. John Ringling may have started in the 1880s as a simple circus man, but some 15 years after his death, he had become known as an astute collector of the finest of art. Today, especially in Sarasota, he is known as a remarkable art expert as well as the Circus King. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. Thanks for dropping by Stingray Tom's Florida, and don't forget to visit my website, stingraytom.com, where you can travel through time around the Sunshine State.